Find the sort of syntax first for the useful tools that you may need. Wear the pendant of performance for efficiency and speed. Cautions crystal clears the sky with triple equals and try catch, avoiding stuff that sucks and parsing better numbers out of stretch. At last the golden shining mail of modularity. When namespace closure imports long defend integrity. For polished skills in JavaScript, the treasure trove this is. Now raise your sword and strike your shield with these best practices.
Well friends, your journey here is almost complete. In this last level, we'll be taking a look at the module design pattern in JavaScript. First, we'll look closely at the basics of a simulated namespace in JavaScript, which is the foundation for any module. Thereafter, we'll look at how to create public and private state data through the use of anonymous closure, which can sometimes be very hard to grasp. Next, in keeping with our best practices of clarity and data protection, we'll examine the use of global imports, which will allow us to carefully and clearly use external data inside of our modules. Lastly, augmentation will wrap things up so that you can add functionality and properties to your modules even after they've been built inside other files. So you've got your sword, you've got your pendant, you've got your crystal. Now it's time to don the mail of modularity. Hey guys, welcome back to level 4, the final level of JavaScript best practices, the mail of modularity. In this first section, we'll take a look at the basics of a namespace. You write a JavaScript file, I write a JavaScript file, everybody writes a JavaScript file, and conflicting code within those files can cause overwrites. JavaScript files often have conflicting global elements if they're not built well, and that can overwrite existing very important data. Let's take a look at that. So say we had a Hall of Fame website document here. You can see various HTML elements as well as some unordered lists and some script files that we call just before the end of the body tag. Let's say that this first script was built by the same author who built the entire HTML structure. And that's going to report the current members of the Hall of Fame. Later, she asks a colleague to please build a short file that's going to list just the requirements for Hall of Fame selection. So in the first file, the halloffame.js file, we've got a list of all the guys that are in the Hall of Fame currently. To add those guys to the unordered list in the HTML document that has the ID hof, H-O-F, we'll get that element by ID and store it in a variable called hof. Next, we've got a fragment, which will help our best practice of touching the DOM as little as possible, and then an element that we will use to add a list item. But then our friend comes along and we get the requirements.js file, and inside that you can see the Rex list there, an array of stuff that a knight has to do to get into the Hall of Fame. That's be a cool kid, slay a dragon, good at sorting, right? Stuff knights should be able to do, for sure. And then, though, we have a new list variable being declared and assigned that's going to pick up that unordered list under selection requirements with the ID of Rex, R-E-Q-S. Now, the existing list that was in the previous file gets overwritten due to hoisting. Both of those variables would be global, and since one was declared after the other, the second overwrites the first. Now, is that a big deal here? Well, maybe not in this case, because the first list is already done being used. Everything that had happened inside the Hall of Fame file is already done and ready to roll. And so declaring that new list variable inside of the requirements.js file is not such a huge deal. But there are ways in which this could become a huge deal. So let's take a look at those. What if halloffame.js only really provided a global method for displaying the HOF members instead of just displaying them immediately as soon as the script file was loaded and run? Instead, what it does is creates a global function called display HOF, display Hall of Fame. So we scoot our Rex list down here, and now we're going to put a button under the honorable members header. And on the click of that button, we're going to actually call, using an inline JavaScript, display HOF. So when the button is clicked, that's when the members of the Hall of Fame actually get displayed. Now, what kind of problems might this cause? Well, by the time that both of those script files have been retrieved, loaded, and run, Display HOF, the new function, the global function, is going to be in memory and ready to be used upon the click of that button. But now that that second requirements file has created that second list global variable, it overwrote the first. And so display HOF would no longer find the exactly correct list of Knights in the Hall of Fame. Instead, it finds that other global created in requirements.js. What can we do about that? Well, enter the simulated JavaScript namespace. Though a namespace is not really native, so to speak, to JavaScript, the namespace concept that is found throughout programming can limit global impact and also provide us with some data protection. So, to build that namespace, we're going to rewrite our halloffame.js file. The first thing that we do, the key to creating a namespace, is a single global object, and that's commonly called the wrapper for the space, for the namespace. By convention, you will very often see a namespace capitalized entirely. Now, all the variables that were formerly declared in the global scope will now just be properties of the Hofmaster namespace. Additionally, the displayHof function will also belong to the Hofmaster namespace, which means we'll need to reference the calling object on all the needed variables using this. Now that that function and all of the necessary variables are actually encapsulated within the Hofmaster namespace, we're going to need that Hofmaster name as a header syntax in order to call that displayHof method. What does that mean? It means that the name of the namespace will act as this shield, this armor around your data. By using that mini environment, sort of a data container, it's going to add a layer of protection that we don't always get if we just incorporate everything as a global variable. So now, if our globally unfriendly file tries to make an impact on that document scope, the master information, the one we cared the most about, the data that we enjoyed the most, we wanted that to stay very protected. That doesn't get impacted at all. Now, ideally, all of your JavaScript files will incorporate a namespace of some sort, because a namespace is really going to reduce your global footprint on the entire application. This is very useful for very large web applications. It's also going to keep your data grouped very carefully around their intended functionality. That's really important. So here you can see, to rewrite that requirements.js file, we've given it a requirements namespace, notice all caps, and inside there, of course, are the bunch of properties and methods that the requirements things need in order to be produced in our HTML file. What do you notice here? Well, namespaces tend to remain agnostic of each other, right? Unless the file builders are building those namespaces specifically to work with each other. And that's very useful for data protection. Another thing to note about namespaces that's cool is that nested namespacing is very frequent in JavaScript, and especially in a module pattern, more of which we'll be discussing as the sections move forward in this level. Now, nesting namespaces provides even further organization, even further grouping and protection, as well as keeping the variable names very intuitive if you need them to be. This means that you could have multiple list variables inside of multiple namespaces without each impacting the other. For example, here, we've got a new biographies namespace as a property of the Hofmaster namespace. A new layer of scope groups all that related data, but it shields it by requiring all of the namespace references. You can see here in my call to hofmaster.biographies.unfoldBio, I can pass in a list variable that incorporates the knights who are in the Hall of Fame, but I need to use that Hofmaster reference in order to make it happen. That's going to distinguish it from the Hofmaster list, which you can see holds the knights, and the list inside the biographies namespace, which holds only some useful list of biography data about each of the knights that are in the Hall of Fame. So that is a quick and dirty exposure to the idea of the namespace concept inside of JavaScript. Now, we're going to send you to some challenges to work with some namespaces, and we'll see you back for the rest of the level soon.